So let's talk about what are the issues that are facing you in Europe as a movement leader, a leader of church planters. Well, one of the things you have to initially realize is that you live in a conundrum. The conundrum is what has gotten you here, namely church planting, won't get you there, namely to a movement. What has gotten you here, that you are a church planting practitioner, won't get you there, meaning a movement leader. So, church planting success is realized in involvement. Those of us who plant churches do it, and we do it well. We've done it time and time again. Many of us, we know how to do that. That is our great strength, but that is also our great problem. We know how to do that, but we really don't know how to do a movement. Involvement in church planting can hinder a movement. In the business world, they talk about entrepreneurs and business leaders. And they say that oftentimes entrepreneurs, people who have the new idea, the creativity, they can even design and produce a product, they run poor businesses. They know how to generate the product, but they don't know how to do a business. So it's sort of the same way with church planters. We know how to do it on the ground, but we don't know how to engineer or trust God or be a part of a movement. A movement demands that leaders work on the ministry rather than in it. Or in some of our situations, it's going to be both at one time. It's like building a bridge while you're on it, to use a metaphor that is common today by Robert Quinn. You are planting a church in your culture, but you're also helping those who are planting churches get to a movement beyond themselves. So what has gotten you there won't take you there. You need different kinds of skill sets. What are the challenges for a movement leader? There are 5. First, to shepherd a dynamic spiritual movement. It needs to be more than the mechanics of how do you do this. How do you plant a church? How do you get to the first generation, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth generation in terms of gestation periods? It's more than the mechanics of disciple making or evangelism. It's more than the mechanics of leadership development. It's a spiritual endeavor. It's a spiritual endeavor. That means that you must be surrendered to the Lord. The ministry in and of itself must be surrendered to the Lord. It's His work. You're His workman. You're His partner, but He's the boss. So you surrender yourself and you surrender the ministry to Him, the movement to Him, which means that you have to have a worshiping posture, which says, Lord Jesus, anything, anytime, anywhere, I am willing. It means the answer is yes, Lord. Now, what is the question? It's a spiritual endeavor, and those who lead movement leaders will lead them in spiritual practices. They will have a spiritual community together before they think about how to do this church planting movement. So that's very important to know, that one of your challenges is not initially to look at the mechanics of movement, but at the spiritual heart of a movement, which is a life surrendered to God and a community surrendered to the Lord and surrendered to the lost people, the people that you want to reach. Secondly, the second challenge of a movement leader is to discover, empower, and coach church planting leaders. If you are a movement leader, and that's what you are in your countries, then your first assignment is to prayerfully scout out future church planters. Those are people who are practitioners, who are doing it, but those are also people who are not yet doing it because they've not been discovered. They're going to be teenagers, they're going to be women, they're going to be people in the business world that need to be challenged toward a greater vision. You need to challenge business people who are very successful in their world to invest in something greater than their business. They know how to make money, they know how to build a business, and you need to tell them that there's something that is much more significant in this world than building a business. And they need to be involved in something that would outlive them, and that is kingdom work. The business world is a stepping stone to do something greater, and you need to give them the vision for that. Bill Hybels says that many Christian leaders today, pastors especially, do not know how to challenge business people. We're afraid of business people because we aren't business people, by and large. We've been to Bible school, we've had a hard row, we've had a hard time to get to where we are. Oftentimes we struggle with money, and to be with a person who is probably a millionaire or multimillionaire, that's sort of out of our league, and we have so much respect for these people that we don't know how to approach them. But we need to have the courage to go up to them and say, God has blessed you as a business person. Now, what is the next level? What is the next step of your business? It's not just growing a bigger business or more businesses, but it's being involved in kingdom work. So you need to scout out church planters who are doing significant things in non-ministry areas and get them into the ministry. You need a profile. Yeah. The profile, you can look online, do Google search on 13 qualities of highly successful church planters by, his name escapes me right now, but I will come up with it. This is a PhD at a university in the United States who several years ago did a study on highly successful church planters, about 300 of them in North America. And he came up with 13 characteristics. I can tell you some of them sort of by heart. They're visionaries, so they're future-driven. The future drives them, it pulls them. They're not people who love the status quo. They love change and risk-taking. They are people who can create a sense of ownership. So if you are in their team or in their sphere of living, they will empower you and give you the sense that this endeavor is their endeavor. It's not just your thing, it's their thing. So they're shareholders, and they can convey to you that you are a shareholder in this new endeavor. These are people who have the gift of faith, usually. They can trust God for things that are above and beyond their own means and capacity to reach. They are people who create a following. They're leaders. So you can always tell a visionary leader by the people that follow them. These are some of the things. You can look at these 13 qualities of highly successful church planters. Give the list to people that you think might have it. If they read the list through, and they can do this in 2 minutes, say to them, if 8 or more of these qualities fit you as a leader, then you're probably a church planter and we need to talk. I have done this over the years with people in ministry who I've seen have done significant pastoral ministry, and I've surmised that they're really church planters. And I remember going to one German guy who was involved in youth work, who was doing tremendous creative things, who was terribly frustrated by the main senior pastor because the senior pastor was stepping on the brakes and this guy was on the gas pedal all the time. Going to him and giving him the list of these 13 qualities. And his eyes got bright and he said, "This is me! This is me!" And he's planting our second church right now. In a Hillsong city in southern Germany. Hillsong has 400 people in this church, and we're planting a German free church in the shadow of Hillsong that's going to be, it's going to rival Hillsong, because this is a church planter. He's audacious. He's bold. He's not afraid of risk-taking. He's an amazing person. But it started out with having a profile and challenging him. So you need to have some sort of template. What is the profile of a church planter? And who has this profile? When I'm with a person like this too, I will ask him for a list of people who are like him or her. So tell me about other people that you know that are like you. So they say, okay, when I think about it, well, over here, this person here, and over there, that person there. And so they give me a list of potential church planters that I can then also contact. So you need to discover, and then you need to empower. Church planters need sponsors, especially older people in pastoral ministry. They need somebody to shepherd them and to say, I'm going to cover you. I'm going to take the heat. If you make mistakes, it's going to be, I'll take the blame for that because I'm going to be your sponsor. You need to know how to coach church planters. In my book, The Jesus Model, I delineate a coaching system that I've developed with a checklist for all the 4 phases of church planting that you can use in coaching church planters. Your challenge as a movement leader is to formulate audacious faith goals and to communicate them regularly. Did you know that vision dies every 30 days? If you look at the book of Nehemiah, they were rebuilding the wall, and after 26 days, they stopped rebuilding the wall. The wall was not yet finished, but after 26 days, they stopped rebuilding the wall. You know why they stopped rebuilding the wall? Because they lost the reason for what they were doing. They knew how to do it, but they forgot why they were doing it. So vision dies every 30 days, and you know that vision leaks, and you must instill fresh vision in your movement and in your leaders every 30 days in creative ways. But the goals that you have, they have to be audacious. They have to be above and beyond human means and capacity to reach them. This is what we call faith goals. Only God could reach these things. Only God could do these things. But God wants to link up with people who can see that. You need then, fourthly, to guide leaders to solve their ministry hurdles. When they have a problem and they come to you with a problem in ministry, you are not to solve their problem. You are to lead them to solve their own problems. Everybody who comes to you with a problem has the answer already in him, and you have to awaken that answer through good coaching. One of the ways I do that is when somebody comes to me with a problem, I say, well, that's interesting. Well, that's a great problem, or that's a great challenge. What options do you have, can you come up with to solve that problem? And they say, well, how about this and that and that? And if they run out of options, I may suggest another option that might be viable. And then I say, well, you've just mentioned 2 or 3 or 4 options, and I'll mention them specifically. And I say, what from these 3 or 4 options that you've just discussed, which one would be the best one for you to actualize in the next 30 days? And he chooses, and he goes with it. So you help him solve his problem or reach his challenge. And then lastly, you need to fan the flames of the church planting progress. What motivates people is not just an inspiring vision, but inspiring stories, and then also the need for this vision to be accomplished. My father died when he was 58, and he died of kidney failure. I'm 56. I look like I'm 55, okay? But, yeah, this is true confessions. But my doctors have been saying to me for years, Dietrich, you need to have your kidneys checked every year because your father died as a relatively young man at 58. You know what I do? I nod and I don't do anything. What man in his right mind will voluntarily go to the doctor if he doesn't have any pain? I don't do that. But one day, I discovered blood where it wasn't supposed to be. I was at my general practitioner and at a specialist within an hour and a half. What motivated me to change was not the vision of my father dying as a relatively young man. but my own need. What will get people to change is to see the need and to pair that up with an inspiring vision and to tell stories along the way of how the vision is being reached. Stories motivate people amazingly well. So where is it being lived out? Where is it being fleshed out? Can you surface those stories and have people tell their stories? What is the pathway to becoming a movement leader? Well, the first pathway is to be a practitioner, to be a church planter yourself, or to be involved in a church planting team. You need to know what these people are going through, the joys and the pains. And you need to have been in that context and smelled that rarefied air of church planting in order to know what your people are going through. You need to learn from the best practices outside of your own church culture or network or denomination. Some of the best things that are happening are on the fringes of denominations, on the fringes of networks. Nobody has written these things down yet, but they're happening. You need to discover these things. And it is probably outside of your own culture. You know your culture. You need to get outside of that culture and learn from these people. You need an inspiring vision, something that would grab you. The French have the vision now of going from one evangelical church for every 30,000 French people to one for every 10,000 in the country. I think it's beautiful. I mean, that would almost motivate me to become a Frenchman. But yeah, but to eat baguette every day, I don't know. But it's inspiring. Every time I hear that and get with your people, I'm just inspired. This is wonderful. You need to adhere to I call them the G7 principles of multiplication that I have been talking about in these days, that I have written about in my book, The Jesus Model. These are the 7 characteristics of movement from a European context. This is really important. Most of movement literature is outside of our continent. So pay attention to these 7 characteristics of movement multiplication. And then lastly, the pathway to becoming a movement leader is constant surrendering the movement to God and yourself. So you end or you continue where you begin. Constant surrender, constant surrenders. Lord, it's on the altar, it's yours. I'm on the altar, I'm yours. Do something grand, do something beautiful, do something great. So, in a nutshell, these are the things that are facing you and the ways for you to get there.
Just some thoughts on movement, and my background is not one necessarily of movement, but it is of change, and seeing how systems change and how change happens. And just some ideas as I was listening to Dietrich here. You know, a movement is nothing more than a collective of individuals. So as an individual, what stirs your heart, what gets your head to see a way to do it, and what allows your body then to take action, a movement is a bunch of individuals feeling the same way. So if you think about, and I think it goes, I think movements, a lot of that, and jump in anytime you want. I think it starts that way. It starts in your heart. There's something that calls you or calls a person to something bigger. There's a head realization that, oh, there is maybe a way to make this heart desire happen. And then finally, there's a bodily movement, an action that this is now what I will do to get there. Okay, so if you're planting a church, there's somebody whose heart you touch that says, not only maybe do I want to accept Christ, but that I want to be part of growing this fellowship of believers together. And I've always felt in my heart that I should be together with other believers. I now hear that you're planting a church. That gives me a way to do it, and therefore I will come and bring my friends. A movement is just a scale of that. If you think about it, hundreds of people or thousands of people whose hearts are touched, suddenly they have a way to do it, something that's moving in that direction, and then they take action to go there. So to begin to think about that, the other part is there's an old saying that it's hard to steer a parked car. All right, movement. If you think about the word, I mean, it is an active word, and so if you're not planting churches, if you're not evangelizing, if you're not moving, then it's very hard for movement to begin. You know, I've known a lot of groups that will talk about movement in conferences like this, and it's an academic discussion. It's a little like learning to swim. You know, you can't go to a seminar in this room. I could tell you all about swimming, but until you got in the pool, you wouldn't know how to do it. It wouldn't make sense. Movement is the same way. That if you were out there planting a church, and Dietrich spoke to this, or working in a community, one thing to realize is wherever you are, God is already there. You know, Jesus said that. He talked about the disciples visiting him, and they said, "When did we visit you?" And he said, when you came to me in prison." Well, that means when they went to prison, Jesus was already in prison. You know, so if you think about a part of the town or city or everything where you're planting a church, it's not like you're bringing the gospel to these people. Jesus is already there, and he's inviting you into the work he's already predestined. And so if you think about that, and you think about Christ is there moving ahead of you, then somebody once said the Holy Spirit, or the Bible talks about the Holy Spirit is like wind. And a friend of mine once said, you know, wind you can't control, but you can harness. Right? If you think about a sailboat doesn't control the wind. It only arranges its sails to move where the wind wants to take it. Much the same happens then, I think, with movements and that kind of thinking. If you're feeling led to go into a part of the city and you're beginning to do things, the most important thing in my mind is you need to have your eyes open to what God is already doing and where he may be directing you, instead of your plan on how you're going to do it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I had a pastor in the UK call me 6 months ago. And they said, I've got this idea. I want to bring together 5 or 6 pastors in my city. And we want to meet together for a day or two and find a place in the city. We'll pick a place in the city. We'll all come together and figure out how can we go impact that city, that part of the city for Christ. And they asked me, would you come facilitate that session? And I said, well, I could, but actually I don't think you should waste your time doing that. And he said, why not? And I said, well, pastors, my opinion, and I'm not a pastor, but pastors are very busy people, and they all have their own calling already. If you're asking them to say, trying to put aside your calling, get together, try to find something we can all agree to do in this part of the city, it's going to be something that's so small on each of their parts, it's not going to have an impact where you're trying to do, because it's additional to what God has called them to do. I said, now on the other side, if you bring together a group of pastors and you allow them all to share their hearts and what they're doing and what their strengths are and where God is calling them, and what happens to emerge are common areas that they're all doing. Like, oh, you're working with human trafficking, we're working with human trafficking. Well, so are we. And out of the 6 pastors that come together, 4 are working on human trafficking, and you say, how might we work together on this issue? Well, now you're letting me play to my strength and leverage what we're doing. You're not asking me to do something new. Does that make sense? The first example would almost be an example of trying to mechanically, to Dietrich's point, orchestrate a movement. I'm going to get the people together. We're going to go through these things. We're going to pick a part of the city. We're going to go have an impact. And in America, for example, the church has become so programmatical that we think doing programs like that is making movements. And it's really not. It's a program. It has a beginning and an end. It has something you do. Everybody has a defined role. It's usually very controlled. You know, a big church comes into a city for a day of supporting the city, and they clean things up and they do great things, and then they leave. That's not capturing someone's heart that says we need to transform where we are. And we need to move where we're going. And so the mechanical place of doing that is very different than following where God is and coming together with others who God has touched to do the same thing. You know, it doesn't mean every church needs to do it. It doesn't mean every leader. But if the Holy Spirit is going to start a movement, then then it is going to touch other people to move in that direction. And to Dietrich's point, you have to hold on to that direction very loosely. I worked with a pharmaceutical company years ago, and it was the only company I've ever worked with that one of their values as a company was serendipity. Serendipity means you do things, it's by mistake. And what they said was, because they were working on cures for very specific diseases, most of the cures they found were not for the diseases they started out going after. You know, that they were trying to work on some kind of, a blood disease, and what they found is they had a cure for a breathing disease. That is kind of the idea with a movement, or with even church planting or something. You have a desire to serve God and move in that, but He may have a different way of doing it than you think. So that's kind of one thing on it. The other... A friend of mine says, Ephesians 2:10 talks about God has prepared good works for each of us, which He has prepared beforehand. That we're going to go do good works that He has prepared ahead of us. And so my friend says, then the Christian life is more like archaeology than it is construction. We're not building something for God. We just have to discover what God already wants to build. And so I think, again, that similar kind of idea that says we want to create a movement and how to do it. Now, within that construct, I also believe, just to what Dietrich said, there is a role for us. You could then say, well, if a movement's going to happen, all I need to do is sit back and pray and never leave my house, and I'm sure God will make it happen. And He could. But most of the time, again, it's because the men and women of God are out doing something. We are called to be light in a dark world. We are being catalysts for something that's happening. And so I think for a leader, there is always that challenge of, I don't want to be egotistical, and I don't want to say this is my plan, and I don't want to be the leader of this movement, but yet is God calling me to be the one to step out in the movement and to do these things and to gather these people? And that's why I think it's really important always to have a group of advisors around you, people who can really speak truth and are seeking God with you, to say, I know leaders who really could be used for something, and they've never stepped up to do it. And I know other leaders who really think that they are doing something and it's all in their mind. Okay? And again, it's this movement is this balance of practical things you're doing and or mechanical, almost process things you're doing, and then space you're creating that you're allowing it to move. And it's a hard tension. Just like as a church planner, if you are focused internally on planting your church, it's very hard for you to then consider, how does my church fit in the context of a greater movement? If all your time is getting people in your church and thinking about what that means and taking care of your small flock and doing things like that, then it's probably hard for you to get your eyes up and think, how can I help these 5 other churches around me? Because you think, my plate's full just doing my own. And there's that tension there. And again, that's why I don't know, I'm not a theologian, but I am not sure in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are a lot of references to individual heroes. Judges, prophets, warriors. God raises up a person to do something. I don't know in the New Testament, I mean, you had Paul who went around, but I don't know that there's any real example held up of one person doing something in the New Testament. I think it's all the body of Christ. This is what happened in this area. This is how the Spirit led here. And if there is one or two, it's mostly the body of Christ doing something. And so when you think about a movement, you're thinking, and this gets into the businessman thing. God has equipped so many people. If you're trying to have a movement in an area, because let's make it kind of specific, you're really trying to impact an area where you are, not. And if God turns this into something bigger, it does. There are skills and abilities and desires and passions of all these individuals. And the part of the movement thinking is, how do I let them play to their strengths and release what God has given in them versus taking them and saying, I want you to go do this. A businessman shows up at a church really excited to do everything he can for God, and they go, oh, you're a businessman. Can you be on the finance committee? and instead they are a global strategist who, if you said, do you think you could really do a survey of our city and find out the people who are here and what the patterns of growth are? Oh, they'd be all about that because that's what they do for a living, but we don't look at what their individual thing is. A side note on that, a friend of mine who is a pastor talks about, and we were talking about this yesterday, most pastors think about serving their community from a needs-based perspective. Somebody in the community has a need, I get the people in my church and I say, let's go see if we can fit the need. So let's say you have a church and you have 5 or 10 people who are all in the medical community. They're all doctors. And the need comes up in the school. Our school has this need. And you have to go to them and say, how could you go work in this school? And they give their time and they try to volunteer at the school to help the school. But it's not their experience. It's probably not their passion. It's not what they do all the time for a living. But if you as a pastor think about, in my church, why has God given me 6 or 8 medical people? That is now the strength of ability that I have in my church. I'm going to look for needs based on strength, based on what I have, not what the need is. So somebody comes to me to the school, you can kind of say, that's great, maybe we can help you. Somebody comes to you and goes, what the problem is in our community? We don't have access to good medical care on the weekends. Then you go, wait a minute, I got 8 people that work in the medical profession. I bet if I went to them and said, do you guys think any way that you could go serve the community, they'd be all over that. So it becomes a releasing mindset that movement leaders have. They're continually trying to say, to Dietrich's point again, they're continually trying to say, you have these abilities, you go do this. And kind of move it in the direction that all things are headed together, rather than a gathering kind of responsibility that says we just won't bring people in. 2 examples of that I can think of in the U.S. of ministries that do one or the other, and they both deal with very successful businessmen. One is a movement called Halftime. It was started by a guy named Bob Buford. He had a cable television company. He sold it. And he said he spent the first half of his life being successful. He wanted to spend the second half being significant. And he wrote a book, Halftime. And the book sold thousands of copies to people in their 50s and 60s who'd retired, or in their 30s who just sold their company and made millions of dollars, some high-tech guy. And here's a man talking about working really hard in business. Now, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And thousands of people have read that book, and his little sort of practice of sort of of people he had with him would advise people on how to live that life and what to do with that and where to go. And it was all giving out, and there were more people that did this than he's ever met because he had the book. It really did start a movement of Halftime, a movement of thinking about what am I going to do in the latter part of my life that touched thousands of people across the United States and around the world. Another friend of mine has a program called the Master's Program. And it's it's probably the best Christian teaching principles I've seen applied to business people. And he has business people come in and they meet once a quarter, so 4 times a year, for a full day to hear his teaching and all these principles so they can go apply it to their life. It's really, really good. He talks about it like it's a movement. He says this is a movement from the Master's Program. It's not. It's a 4-time-a-year program. And the difference there is about coming into a program and the quality it is and doing better. And in this case, just from the example, having a book that teaches people, that impacts people that you don't even know it's impacting. One was much more a giveaway kind of ministry. The other one was kind of a gathering ministry. And I think there's a couple of examples on movement or not. Does this make sense? I think the last thing, and then we can talk about it some more, is to me movement. Implicit on the definition of movement is it's movement from something to something. Movement. Therefore, there's change involved. And I think we underestimate the requirement of change. You have to give up something, or you're going to do something in order to move in the change, or to change to go do something. And a friend of mine says, like in culture, the way you work with an organization, they want to create a new culture, okay? Or you're in a town, you want to create a new culture, all right? The way you create culture is by creating more culture. If you run around saying what you're doing is bad, you need to stop it, you'll never stop it. If you suddenly get more and more people that are, so take cigarette smoking. Cigarettes, in the 50s were the glamorous thing to do. I mean, there's not a movie star who didn't smoke. I mean, it wasn't just when the movie stars, the cool kids started doing it, everybody smoked. Well, over time, they realized that smoking is unhealthy for you. And they kept saying, it can change, you can do better. All of a sudden, you had the movie stars who were saying, I'm not doing that anymore because it's not healthy. And people wanted to follow that. And more of a culture of health came over a culture of that. And pretty soon, it's just changed. It's not the thing you want to do anymore. And there's still people who do it, but it's not like wildly accepted in America. Every restaurant now, the laws have changed where you can't smoke in the restaurants. I mean, that's happened over years. If you just go around in your city then saying, I know a pastor in a town in the U.S., and when he showed up, he was the self-proclaimed, he called himself the self-proclaimed sort of Jerry Falwell, who was a U.S. pastor of this town. And he said, I knew everything I was against. This shouldn't be done, that's bad, I can tell you what, he knew what he was against. And he said he woke up one day and God spoke to him and said, you know everything you're against, but you don't know what you're for. And he changed his whole dynamic. And he took his church from one that was speaking against everything to one who was releasing its people to serve the community and to do more. And I think that's the way you change the cultures. You begin to think, suddenly more and more people, it's not that they're going to church, it's they're wanting to live a better life. They're wanting to have the joy and peace and the fruit of the Spirit that's promised by God. And if they start to get that, they're going to want to have more of that. And they're going to want to ask their friend, how come you're like that? I'm still pretty miserable. And the more you see doing that, the more they're going to want to do that. And so just one thing about change is the way you change cultures, you have to create more culture. It has to move more and more in that direction. And eventually there's a tipping point where that becomes the way things are done more. And so just in a thought about that, what are you doing to create more? What are you doing to allow this to happen more is kind of a way to think about it. Two big levers for changing culture. One is the language you use, and the other is what you celebrate. So you think about it as a pastor or in a community, you can begin to use new words. You can begin to talk about unity or collaboration or success in our society or these words that people will start to cue on. In America, I was trying to think, I don't know if it's started a movement, but there'll be, especially with social media today, there'll be some phrase or something that'll happen, and boy, suddenly everybody's saying that. Everybody knows that term. There's a word now, a language that we didn't know we had that now you're moving on. Words can be very powerful. The other thing is what you celebrate. If you're in your church and you're celebrating an individual who did something because God's called them and is moving in that direction, or a team that worked with another church and you did something, everybody wants to be celebrated. And if they see that that's what you're celebrating, they're going to want to do that too. And again, you're celebrating successes, you're building on strengths, you're creating momentum for a movement. So just some thoughts like that. The last one I have, and then we'll let you talk about it and answer some questions, talk about G7. The last thought I have, there's an interesting book out called The Power of Habit by, I can't remember the author's name. And he talks about how habits are made and as an individual level. But I think the last chapter, last 2 or 3 chapters, he talks about how movements are made. And he kind of correlates the individual habit thing to a movement. And I don't remember it all, but he basically, one of the examples he uses is the civil rights movement in America back in the 60s. And he talks about Rosa Parks, who was the woman who refused to move on the bus that was, everybody looks to as that's the point that started the civil rights movement, okay? Well, Rosa Parks wasn't anybody. I mean, she wasn't like a famous person. It wasn't like a leader who said, now we're doing this thing. It just happened. But when it happened, there was some context around her that made it different. One of the context was she used to sew all the dresses for all the rich white people in the town for their daughters when they went to the debutante balls and in the balls in the city. So she had very powerful white friends in the community that knew who she was. And they weren't her close-knit friends, family, the people who bailed her out of jail, but they were the next level of people who knew her enough that there was a concern for her. He talks about the power of 150, that you get 150 people that are concerned for this, so that when her close-knit family rallied around her, 150 people then extended that out about this thinking, and you had the catalyst of this guy named Martin Luther King, who was able to build on that. And so you had a catalytic moment in a context of gasoline, the 150, the things that were happening in the nation, things to start, and then a leader who came in to give all of that kind of shape to move forward. That's kind of, if you think about that as a movement, there are a couple of things. One, the leader, the old Chinese proverb of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. God raises up leaders at times when things are happening. There is a context maybe in your country or your community that it needs the change. You can just feel people are tired of what they're doing or feel that they need to do this. And there may be some catalytic event that God uses the things of the simple to confound the wise, that it didn't seem like much at the time, or you never would have thought that's where it would have started, but that's where it starts. And so you think about things like that, and that it gives you kind of the idea of Christian movement is it's practical and spiritual. It's mystical and operational. There are things we do, things you do. You plant churches, you do things, you build communities. But then there's this spirit that drives things.